I don't usually do a last trip once the nights start dropping under 40. But I'd been staring at a half-packed tote for 2 weeks while telling myself I'd get out there tomorrow. Tomorrow kept missing me. Work kept stretching long. I kept finding reasons that sounded reasonable. Editing, email, one more pass on the script, until the tote started to feel like something I was avoiding. So I picked a weekend, put the tote by the door, and made myself go. I did a quick pass through the cabin around sunset and grabbed what I always forget: extra matches, a second headlamp, the old enamel mug that doesn't burn my fingers the way the titanium one somehow still does. I tossed in the little camp broom because I like a clean tent floor, the repair tape, and the orange bag with the first aid kit that I never opened but would rather have than wish for. I checked the batteries in the radio. I checked the zipper pulls on the tent. I kissed Lauren goodbye and carried the tote down to the car. The sky had that thin, late-season color that never really turns gold. I pulled into traffic, set the cruise 5 under because the highway patrol likes to sit in the shadows after the mill, and told myself I'd get to the trailhead before 10. It wasn't far. I'd camped out that way plenty of times. If I needed to, I could sleep in the car and walk in at first light. The gas station wasn't on purpose. I'd meant to stop at the big chain by the exit, but I missed it while I was singing along to a song I hate, got angry at myself about the lane choice, then laughed because I sounded like every other driver who thinks the highway owes him something. The next ramp dumped me onto a 2-lane that cuts behind the industrial park and curves down past an old billboard skeleton and a stand of pines I didn't remember. The station sat in the crook of the road like it had been there since the war, and no one had bothered to tell it the world moved on. One pump, a lit beer sign, a rattling HVAC unit on the roof, a dog asleep on a rubber mat by the door. I filled the tank because habit is habit, then ducked inside with the mental list I always carry and never write down: propane, batteries, jerky, and something sweet I'll regret later. The place smelled like motor oil, floor cleaner, and old cardboard. The coolers hummed. A rack of maps that hadn't been updated in 10 years leaned on a wire stand. The cashier looked up and nodded without smiling. He had the kind of face that looks carved by wind, a soft cap over white hair, and hands that had done more than scan barcodes. The dog thumped its tail once and went back to being a rug.
Evenin'?
"Hey," I said, and held up the small green propane canister like a kid bringing an apple to a teacher. "You got more of these?" He pointed at a low shelf near the back and watched me the way small-town people watch anybody they don't know. Not suspicious, not friendly, just paying attention because it's what you do. I grabbed 2 canisters, found AAAs in blister packs that looked like they were printed during a different administration, and snagged a bag of jerky that promised pepper and delivered vinegar. I grabbed a Snickers for morale. I added a little bottle of stove fuel because if you don't bring it, you'll need it. I set everything down on the counter and made small talk because I was raised to try. "Quiet night?"
Most are.
He scanned, punched keys on a big square register I hadn't seen in years, and told me the number like it was a verdict. I pulled my card. He looked at it like he didn't trust the square reader but let it do its job. The receipt printed with the sound of a tiny buzzsaw. He handed it over with a pen for the tip line that didn't apply. I signed anyway out of reflex and folded the paper.
Headin' to the lake?
Past it, I'm trying to beat the first hard freeze. One last solo and then I'll go pretend I like gyms for a few months.
Where past it?
I named the forest road, the mile marker, the turn where the paving ends, the spot where the ground dips and there's a pull-off that looks like someone once planned a picnic table and never got to it. His eyes didn't move. I could tell he knew the road. Out here, everybody knows every road.
That's near Dry Branch, right?
I nodded. It's a couple ridges over. He let out a breath through his nose and pressed his lips together like he'd decided whether to say something and didn't like the decision. He glanced at the dog as if it might help. It didn't.
You shouldn't camp out there.
He wasn't trying to sell me anything. He wasn't trying to scare me. He sounded like a man giving a weather report that included hail.
People been hearing things lately.
I always hear things in the woods. I meant it as a light answer, but it came out defensive. He heard it. I heard it. The dog thumped its tail again. He shook his head.
Not owls, not coyotes, not wind. Folks say they hear their own steps, like an echo, but not, Like something doesn't know it's supposed to be on a delay.
I'll keep an ear out, I said, because what else do you say to a stranger you're not going to listen to? He studied me a second longer and then did the thing where you move on because the person in front of you has already made up his mind. He slid the jerky across the counter, let me bag it myself, and looked past me at the door like we were done. When I turned to go, he said one more thing, not loud enough to be advice and not soft enough to be to himself.
Clip your zipper pulls together at night, and if you hear a zipper, don't touch it.
The dog lifted his head at the word zipper. I laughed, because that's my instinct when something is off and I don't want to show it. I always do, I said. Thanks. Outside, the air had that clean, cold sound it gets when it moves over empty fields and dies in the trees. I loaded the propane and batteries, put the jerky on the passenger seat like a treat for later, and got back onto the road. The dog watched me through the window like he'd already seen this story and didn't like the third act. By the time the highway opened back into 2 lanes with no shoulder and the occasional broken reflector, the town lights had fallen behind me. The pines thickened and then thinned. I crossed the bridge over the river that always looks lower than it should. The radio went fuzzy and then came back, never in the same place twice. The stars came on one by one. I turned down the forest road and felt the tires lift tiny dust clouds. I watched the temperature drop a degree on the dash. I told myself I liked this. It was true. I also told myself the cashier's tone was his problem and not mine. That part wasn't. The pull-off looked the way I remembered, though that's always a trick of memory. A patch of bare dirt, 2 faint tire tracks, a wall of black trees that felt like a curtain. I killed the engine and let the quiet fill in the gaps where the machine sound had been living. My ears did the thing they do when they expand to make room for everything else. Breeze, ticking metal, one late cicada giving it all he had from somewhere in the brush. A faint, distant shiver like water over stones. I told myself it was the branch that gave the place its name, a dry bed most of the year that wakes up after a hard rain and thinks it's a river. I set up the tent in the beam of my headlamp in the car's dome light. The ground was cold through my knees. The stakes went in easily, which meant the dirt had given up being stubborn. I ran the zipper pulls to the ends and clipped them together. I've always done that. It's not even about animals, it's about not waking up in the night and thinking the world wants something from me. I shook out the sleeping bag and slid it into place, laid the pad on top like a piece of armor, and checked the corners like a person taking pride in a small, silly task that matters because it's small and silly. Dinner was a quick boil of water and a pouch that promised hearty and delivered salt. I ate it anyway because the body doesn't care what the brain thinks after dark. The sky had turned the color of ash. I listened to nothing and found, as always, that nothing was full of sound. Tiny brittle things moving through leaf litter, the slow lift and settle of branches, a small chorus of creaks that might be trunks or might be the idea of trunks. The soft shift of my jacket when I breathed. I told the recorder I wasn't going to do a full episode out here. I just wanted to see how late in the season I could enjoy being uncomfortable. I said I'd come back with a story if the story came to me. The first night gave me the kind of sleep you get when your brain refuses to admit it wants it. I dozed, rolled, checked the time on my watch without really seeing it, and woke from an almost dream about forgetting something back at the gas station. When I finally fell deep enough to dream about nothing, I came up fast because I'd heard something I believed with my whole body before I could decide what it was. They were soft, and they weren't close, but they were there, and they moved when I moved. Not exactly the same beat, just enough off to make me question whether I was listening to myself shift on the pad or something outside the tent shifting because I shifted. I held my breath to give the world the floor. A small breeze ran a hand through the trees and let it go. I told myself it was me. I told myself to sleep. I slept in patches until my bladder got to vote. I unzipped the inner door with the care of a cat burglar, slid out of the bag, and crab walked the 2 steps to the vestibule where the boots live. I listened again, because that's what I do. The quiet made a shape around me. When I took a step, I heard it again. Just behind. Just after. the light press of weight and leaves that weren't mine. I stood still long enough that my legs told me to pick a plan. The plan I picked was to pee like a person in the woods who's not trying to make it into a thing. The sound of it covered everything else and made the night feel normal. When I zipped back up, pants, tent, bag, I told myself I'd invented the whole thing because I'd primed myself in a gas station with a man whose job is to make sure the register balances at the end of the night and whose hobby is untying knots in stories people told him at the pump. Morning announced itself as a color change and a temperature change. I opened the tent to air and the zipper voice felt too loud in the quiet. The Velcro on the fly felt like tearing paper in a church. I made coffee that tasted like warm water because I didn't measure the grounds and didn't care. The sky was clear. The trees held a soft silver edge. There were no footprints around my tent that weren't mine, which is exactly what you expect and not proof of anything. I ate jerky for breakfast and hated myself and felt better. I did the slow walk you do when you're alone and not laid along the little drop toward the dry creek bed where stones show themselves like old bones, up the ridge to find a spot with sun and no wind, over to the curve where you can see two hills frame a piece of sky like a picture. I found nothing special and took it as a gift. The first totem showed up when I came back to camp. It hung at eye level from a low branch of a sapling I could circle with one hand. 15 inches of small sticks bound with something that looked like moss and felt like sinew. 3 cross pieces at odd intervals. No symmetry, no pattern I recognized, no air of craft. The twine, if it was twine, was dark where it touched the wood and pale where it wrapped empty. The whole thing turned slowly because the world moves even when you don't. I don't reach for a cult first. I reach for kids, bored hunters, hikers who saw a movie once and thought it might be funny to see if they could make someone else's scalp tingle. I looked for more. There were none. I took it down because I didn't want it near me and because I wanted it in my hands. The wrap had texture the way old rope has texture when it's been wet and dried 100 times. I pulled at a knot and it didn't give. I set it at the base of the tree and left it there because I didn't want it in the tent and I didn't want it near the fire and I didn't want to carry it around like a charm or a dare. I made a fire anyway. I like the way smoke smells until I have to wash my hair twice. I boiled water for noodles I told myself I'd earned by walking 2 miles on not much sleep. The radio picked up a station out of a town I haven't been to in 10 years and played 3 songs in a row that were big the year I thought I'd be a different person. Between songs, the static stepped in and walked around the room. I moved the antenna. It helped, and then didn't. I turned the radio off and liked the quiet again for an hour, then missed the human voice and turned the radio back on and got static that sounded like it wanted to speak but didn't know my dialect. It was after midnight when the lantern showed itself. I'd been lying in the bag, listening to the last coals tick down and felt the kind of light you feel in your eyes even when they're closed. A dim, off-white circle moved between trunks like someone trying not to be seen and failing by choice. It wasn't bright. It didn't swing the way a handheld light swings, not really. The motion was small and constant, like a person with a practiced wrist. I propped myself on one elbow and watched through the mesh. The circle moved left to right. It moved behind 3 trees, the right distance for its distance, then paused near the place where the dry creek starts a shallow bend. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear brush. I didn't hear a voice. I did hear a zipper. Not loud, not at my door, just the sound of teeth parting somewhere close enough that my whole body recognized it before my mind did. The light moved at the same moment, toward the sound, not toward me, but close enough that my hand went to the multi-tool without me deciding. The zipper sound stopped and didn't finish. No voices followed, no sorry, no wrong tent, no hey man. The light held its distance and then dimmed the way a battery dims when someone stubborn refuses to admit it's time to stop. It faded into the trees like it had changed its mind about being a thing that had to be seen. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept reminding myself to breathe. I kept reminding myself I'd locked the zipper pulls. I kept reminding myself that a person who wants to come into your tent isn't going to be stopped by etiquette. The wind picked up and the fly flapped like a slow heartbeat. I checked the time and felt the number on the watch face fall straight down inside me like a coin into a well. 3 a.m. It's always 3 a.m. in stories because it's always 3 a.m. when you're awake and you wish you weren't. Dawn came the way it does, without effort. I found another totem on the far side of camp, lower this time, only a foot off the ground, like something that couldn't reach higher had tied it. This one had fewer sticks and more wrap. A pale scrap of something soft was knotted into it. I didn't want to decide what it was. I nudged it with a stick and told myself I was being a scientist and not a child. When I moved it, I saw prints I hadn't seen in the lower light. Not boot prints, not deer, not anything I could name with confidence. Small ovals pressed where there's not much weight, and deeper marks where there is, a stagger I couldn't map to 2 legs or 4. I followed them 5 yards and lost them where the ground went from soft to soft with leaves, which is basically the same material in a different outfit. I found my own prints on the way back to camp and didn't like what they told me. They came from the direction of the ridge where I hadn't walked yet. They were the same pattern as my boots because they were my boots. They pointed toward my tent, there were no prints pointing away. I stood there long enough to feel stupid and then told myself what any sane person says. Somebody else has the same boots. People buy the same boots all the time. People step the same way. The ground loses edges overnight. It was nothing. I took a picture anyway because my brain wanted a witness. The picture made the prints look less clear. I took another and it didn't help. I saved them both because I always save the thing that doesn't help, just in case it turns useful when I'm not looking. The radio didn't want to be my friend that afternoon. It found a station and then lost it, found another and let a voice ride a sentence halfway and then drowned it with a sound I can only describe as voices wearing static like a coat. I turned the volume down to nothing and heard it anyway in my head, a whisper that had no words, until I gave it words and then stopped having them as soon as I tried to listen. It made the hair on my wrist stand up, which is not something my wrists do. I turned the radio off and put it under my jacket like that would help. I hung the food bag halfway through the afternoon because I wanted to feel like I'd done something smart. I checked the car battery by starting the car just to be sure, which is a dumb thing people do when they're trying not to worry about dumb things. The engine turned over and sounded the way it always does. I let it run for a minute and shut it down and told myself it would be fine. I made tea and drank it barely sweet. I stretched because my back had a complaint I couldn't answer. I told the recorder I didn't have a story and then immediately apologized to the part of me that hates when I jinx a night by saying it out loud. It got cold faster. There's a point in October where the sun starts lying to you around 5. It looks like it's still there and then it isn't, and your hands go from fine to not fine without a middle. I ate early, cleaned the pot with a piece of bread like a cheat, and put on the extra socks I tell myself are for sleeping but always wear before I lie down. I checked the zipper pulls and then checked them again, because I'd told that man I'd lock the tent and it felt like a promise that mattered more than it should have. I heard the steps again after midnight. They were closer and not trying to be anything but what they were. I don't know how to explain the difference between an animal and a person when all you have is sound, but there is one. Animals move on their business. People move like they're thinking about how they move. This was the second kind, but wrong. It matched me when I rolled. It matched me when I sat up. It matched me when I tried not to breathe too loud. When I held breath, it didn't. When I swallowed, it did. When I ran the math in my head for how far it was to the car and how long it would take to start and pull out and what would happen to the tent if I left it staked there, the thing outside took 2 slow steps like it was running the same math and didn't like my options either. I said hello because humans do stupid things when quiet disagrees with them. The sound of it felt like a hand on my shoulder from someone who meant well and didn't. I didn't recognize my own voice. No answer came. The steps stopped. I waited until the cold moved into my thighs and then my ankles and then up my spine. I reached for the radio because it felt like a friend in a different room and turned the volume without turning the power because that's what I meant to do, and then realized it had been on the whole time. The static came up like breath in my ear. That's when the whisper finally found a shape. I'll spare you the melodrama. It didn't say my name. It didn't tell me to do anything. It wasn't an order or a prophecy, it was me. Not my voice exactly, not the way it sounds recorded, but the way it sounds inside my head when I think. That's the part I don't like writing down. The static wore my thoughts the way a wire coat rack wears a coat. It held them up and made them visible. I turned the radio off and it didn't stop, not right away. I put the radio outside the sleeping bag because that felt like keeping it at arm's length would help. I told myself it was the tiredness that makes you think your own brain is a room you can leave. At 3, the lantern came back. It moved with the same careful arc, not too close, not too far, tracing the edge of the camp like it had a map I didn't own. It paused near the first totem's tree, though the totem was gone from the branch where I'd left it at the base. I turned the headlamp on low and pointed it at the tent floor, because shining it out would have felt like talking to someone I didn't want to meet. The zipper sound came again, not at my door, not at any door. A zipper for its own sake. The greedy little metal sound of small teeth doing exactly what they were made to do. The sound stopped and then came from my left, then my right. If you've ever had a mouse in a wall and heard it travel in lines your house shouldn't have, you know the feeling. The light dimmed again and I watched its shadow pass over the mesh like a slow-moving cloud. There's a point where fear gets boring, not less sharp, just old. The body gets tired of the chemistry, the brain says, pick a lane, either do the bad thing or don't. I lay there and found myself irritated by the fact that I wasn't the only one in that conversation. I said I'm leaving in the morning in a voice I meant to be steady and heard how small it was. The steps didn't answer, because steps don't. Morning brought a new problem I'd already suspected, which is worse than a new problem you didn't. The car wouldn't start. The battery didn't even try. The dash stayed dead like it was a piece of stage set, and I'd been fooled all along. I don't leave lights on, I don't leave doors open. I don't listen to the radio with the engine off for more than a minute because I'm that guy. I check the terminals because that's what you do when you've already decided it isn't the terminals. Tight, clean, the hood latch clacked in the quiet, sounded like a choice I didn't like. I used the little spare battery pack I keep for just this purpose and listened to a click that wasn't enough to be useful. The pack has never failed me. It failed me. Okay, fine. People hike out all the time. It's 3 miles to cell service if you know the spot. I knew the spot. I could leave the tent as is and go, and if that meant coming back to a mess, there are worse messes. I packed a small bag with water, the satellite messenger, the map, the rain shell, and the dumb little whistle you never use. I clipped the recorder to the strap because habit is a shelter. I looked once at the tent door, locked, and told myself I'd be back before noon with a tow on the way. I made it as far as the edge of the empty pull-off before I saw the prints again. Mine, not from yesterday. Fresh enough that the edges still had a nap to them. They pointed past the car and into the trees at the angle I'd take if I were sleepwalking or lying to myself about where I'd said I was going. There were no prints pointing back. I stood with my hands on the straps like an idiot version of myself printed on a caution sign and tried to think of a way that made sense without writing a story I didn't want to hear. I followed them because of course I did. They went into the trees, and then into the quieter trees, where the ground holds moisture a little longer and the light stays green 3 extra minutes. They kept a not hurry pace, which is worse than hurry because it implies the walker knew where he was going. I kept catching the smell of old smoke, which doesn't mean anything in a forest this size but felt pointed in a way I didn't enjoy. The prince broke across a patch of stone and appeared again like a magic trick I'd seen once as a kid and didn't understand. My heart kept doing the little lurch thing it does when I can't tell if I heard a voice or a mouth-shaped piece of wind. The campfire sound floated in from ahead. Wrong in the way sound is wrong, when it's been recorded and played in a different room. It had the crackle and the pop and the small hiss of wet pockets doing what they do, but it didn't have location. It felt like it was on my left. Until I turned my head, and then it felt like it was on my right. Like a trick you can do with earbuds when you want to prove something about hearing, and can only prove something about annoyance. I moved toward it anyway because people are drawn to human sound the way the stupidest insects are drawn to porch lights. I started hearing voices under the crackle. Not words, texture. The shape of human air in a throat. When you listen to enough interviews, you can tell age, gender, mood, and whether the person slept last night without hearing a single noun. This was my voice, but not. Again, not the sound of my voice recorded and played back the contour of how I think when I'm tired and pretending not to be. I don't have other language for it that doesn't make me sound like the kind of person who mails you a crystal. I kept moving because that's what the prince told me to do. They knew the path better than I did, and I was the one who'd made them. The lantern showed itself in daylight, like it had given up on pretending to be a night creature. Not bright, but there. A pale circle moving between trunks that had no business hosting a circle. It bobbed once, twice, then held still the way the eye of a storm holds air. The campfire sound grew louder while the air stayed cold. The prints curved and I followed them, and then the trees opened the way they open when you think you found someone else's camp. I did. Mine. The fire burned at a comfortable stage, not too high, not low enough to make you hover. The tent sat where I'd pitched it, door closed, zipper pulls kissed together like a little prayer. My mug was on the log where I'd left it last night. My jacket lay in the spot where I like to sit with my knees up when I eat, a heavy shape I recognized the way you recognize your own shadow. The radio sat on the stump by the foot of the sleeping bag like a friend waiting to be noticed. I felt the shape of the whole scene land in my chest before my brain did any of the steps. I stood in my own camp while I stood in my own camp. The second camp hadn't been there when I left. That's the part that doesn't make sense, and also the only part that matters. The voices under the fire were mine now, not an echo and not a tape. I could pick sentences out of them like fish bones if I tried, and I didn't want to try. I didn't like the thought of my mouth making sounds I hadn't decided to say. The lantern moved behind me without moving, because that's what it does when it's a circle that doesn't belong to a hand. The zipper sound came again. From the tent door this time, not loud, not asking, not trying to scare me, not anything but the sound of metal teeth choosing a new order. The pulls were still locked. They were. I was looking at them. But the sound stayed, soft and patient, small and sure of itself. I walked to the tent. I told myself to stop 3 times before I didn't. My hand knew better than I did and hovered the way you hover before you touch a stove you've already turned off but don't trust. I touched the pulls to prove they were tight and felt the slight give. That means they weren't. They'd been clipped. They were unclipped. I hadn't unclipped them. The breath I took came back out wrong. I said, "Is someone in there?" As if that would make anything make sense. No one answered. The fire spat a little piece of sap. The radio whispered without power. The pulls moved under my hand like a horse's mouth under a flat palm. I eased them down a half-inch because my body has never met a piece of stuck hardware it didn't want to fix, and saw the tiny gap tease open. The little line of darkness that shows you the inside air is different from the outside air. The lantern's edge touched the fabric and made a pale band. I opened the door. The tent was empty. Not slept in empty, empty, empty. No sleeping bag. No pad. No pillow. No stray sock at the bottom of the floor where socks go to pretend they belong to tents now. No imprint of weight. The floor wrinkles were wrong, like a bed made by a stranger who's never seen a bed. The tiny mesh pocket I keep my headlamp in held nothing but itself. The smell was wrong. I've had tents that smell how they smell because nylon and dirt and body. This smelled like the inside of a new backpack, faint chemical clean, like a place that's never been breathed in. The fire cracked a word I didn't know, and the voice under it said it in my voice. I stepped back because I'm not stupid, and because I am. The radio whispered in my chest now and not in my ear. My jacket on the log slumped the way a jacket slumps when someone who is not in it moves a shoulder. I could feel my heartbeat in my jaw. I told myself to walk away and didn't. The lantern dabbed a little light at the wall of the tent and picked out a shape in the fabric that looked like a hand in relief from the other side, and then didn't. I closed the door because that's what you do when a thing in a room doesn't make sense. You put it back where you found it and try to decide if you believe in rooms. The zipper teeth found each other and made that low, greedy sound that is somehow more rude in daylight. The pulls met. I clipped them the way I had clipped them this morning in a different world. I stood with my hand on the metal and didn't move it. If I'd been smart, I would have gone then. I would have left the car and walked out and found a tow, and come back with someone who would laugh at me in the way that would hurt and save me both. Instead, I did the thing the story wanted me to do and followed the sound of myself back toward the ridge because I thought maybe the map in my head was wrong and the map in the sound was right. I don't get credit for honesty here. I get blamed for pride. The prince led away from the tent that was mine and was not and curled back through the quiet grove where the ground stays dark at noon. They doubled, then tripled like a person with bad balance had tried to choose a path and kept changing his mind. They ended in a patch of leaves that held a shape like a crouch and then led nowhere. I stood in the middle of 1,000 small sounds and tried to hear one that belonged to me. The lantern didn't show. The fire sound dialed down until it felt like a neighbor's TV 2 apartments away. I turned in place with the slow care of a diver not trusting the idea of up and found the totems. They'd bred. There were 7 that I counted before I stopped counting. Small, large, low, high, bound with a wrap that wasn't twine but wasn't anything I could name without sounding worse than I sound. Some had little knots that made shapes I didn't like. 2 had hair threaded through them. Real hair, human hair. I didn't touch those. 1 hung so low it brushed the top of my boot and I stepped aside like it was a living thing with opinions about space. I said I'm leaving out loud because there's a point where you either lie to yourself or you don't. The trees took the words and made them sound cheap. I moved back toward the camp because I needed a bag, and because the part of me that makes decisions had gotten tired of asking permission from the part of me that makes trouble. The camp was mine again when I reached it, which should have been good news and wasn't. The fire had gone to ash. My jacket sat where I'd left it last night. No slouch, no invented shoulders. The radio lay on its back with the antenna at the angle I would never set it, which either means I had, or a person who thinks like I think had done me the favor of pretending. I put the radio in the duffel. I broke the tent down faster than I've ever broken a tent. The zipper pulled with the stubbornness of cold mornings and then gave, and all the little motions that have always been muscle memory felt like I was trying to tie shoes and gloves. I packed like a thief who didn't want to be seen by his own stuff. I didn't look at the car until I had to. It started. Of course it started. The dash lit. The engine sang its little tin song. The battery gauge looked like it'd been alive the whole time, and I'd been the one pretending. I laughed in a way I don't like other people to hear. I loaded the duffel and the tote and the food bag and the trash bag because I'm not a monster and shut the hatch, and told myself I was going to drive 20 and keep the tires on the hard part and get to the main road and not look in the rear view more than once. When I put the key in drive, the radio came on by itself. I don't set radios to come on by themselves. The volume was low but not off, like a friend clearing a throat. Static filled the car the way steam fills a bathroom. Under it, the shape of a voice. My voice. Not speaking words and still saying everything I didn't want to hear. I turned the volume to 0 and it took 2 tries, like the knob had some play in it that it never has. I put the car in motion and rolled. The trees did the thing they do on old forest roads when you're sure they're closer than they were. It's perspective. It's angle. It's 2-track ruts that make a person hug a side without meaning to. And still, the trunks felt like they'd moved in 2 feet on each shoulder, like the whole stand had put elbows on the table to listen. I kept my eyes on the strip of knot grass that tells you you're still in the lane. The mirrors tried to tell me stories and I kept them on a diet. Half a mile down, I stopped. Not because I wanted to, because there was a light on the road that shouldn't have been there. Lantern light, low and soft, rested on the gravel like a little moon had fallen asleep. It didn't blind me. It didn't even irritate me the way brights do. It just existed in the space where the road wasn't road anymore. I've driven at night long enough to know what light looks like. This wasn't any light I know. It bobbed once like a person's hand had remembered itself and then held still, as if the person had decided moving would be rude. I put the car in park because both feet had turned to slow animals. I took my hand off the wheel and felt the impression in the leather where I've held it 1,000 times. I said no out loud because that's what was left to say. The lantern didn't care. It moved backward, not in distance but in depth, which is a nonsense sentence you'll understand only if you ever see it. It went away without going away. The road beyond it looked longer than it had any right to, like someone had added a mile during lunch. I drove through the space where it had been because I didn't want to find out what happens if you wait to be asked. The engine thrummed the way it always does. The trees relaxed their elbows. The mirrors stopped telling me about rooms I'd never lived in. When I hit pavement, I could have cried and didn't, because I don't enjoy crying alone when no one can admire my restraint. I didn't look back. The gas station was open, because it's always open. The dog was asleep in a different spot, which is how you know time passes. The cashier looked up and didn't have to decide anything because he'd decided last night. I bought coffee that tasted like coffee from a pot that doesn't love you. I bought a donut that had met air. I held them like talismans.
Make it out?
Made it to here. He nodded, like I'd filled in a blank on a form. He didn't say I told you so. He didn't say anything for a minute, and then he asked.
You hear anything?
Footsteps, I said. Mine. Not mine. A light. A zipper I didn't open. He nodded again and scratched the dog's head, because someone deserved it.
Yeah, they've been hearing that.
What is it? I asked. Not because I thought he'd know, but because I'd been listening to my own head for too long and wanted a stranger's voice to put a fence around the night.
Don't put a name on it. Names make you think you can carry it around careful. Just don't go back. Season's done. Let the cold wash it.
That's the plan, I said. I meant it. Plans are shaky until they're not. I got back to the cabin in one piece. I carried the tote up the stairs like it weighed what it weighed, and not more. I opened my door and stood in the entryway because the smell of my own place had to push the wood smell out of me. I made a late breakfast and ate it while standing because chairs felt like a commitment. I set the recorder on the table and told myself I'd put a note down, just so I'd get the beginning right if I told the story later. I pressed the button and watched the little red light blink on like it was happy to serve. The file that started to play wasn't the file I recorded in the car last week. It was new. I hadn't made it. It had a timestamp for this morning, before dawn, which didn't match where the recorder had been. I didn't press anything else. I just listened. Wind on nylon, the soft tick of cooling poles. A bird that thinks morning belongs to it. Silence long enough to make the silence a thing. And then, clear as teeth. Not loud, not fast, not shy. A zipper. It opened 3 inches and stopped. The teeth waited. The pull slid a little farther, without a hand attached. The sound found the room in my cabin like it had found the room in the trees. I stood very still because there's a kind of memory your body keeps that your head doesn't get to argue with. I didn't play it again. I didn't delete it. I didn't upload it. It sat on the recorder with its little file number like a person sitting on a bench who knows exactly how long the bus will take. I put the recorder in a drawer and closed the drawer and listened to my cabin be a cabin. I slept that afternoon the way you sleep after sickness. I dreamed of nothing I can remember. When I woke, the light in the room had the flat quality of television. I turned on the lamp and the lamp worked. I tried the radio out of habit. It found a station, a real one, with a DJ who'd been told to be chipper and was trying. The batteries in the drawer were where I'd put them. The zipper on the jacket by the door ran up and down without complaint. I felt the scar of something with no wound. I haven't been back to Dry Branch. The map on my wall has 2 pins in that area now, and that's plenty. I didn't keep the totem. I never brought one home. I didn't keep the coffee cup from that gas station either, because I threw it out before I got to the highway. The dog is probably asleep right now on a different mat, in a different spot. The man at the register is probably telling a kid not to do a dumb thing in the dark. I hope the kid listens, and I know he won't. I don't have a moral for this one. I don't have 3 bullet points about safety and shoulder months. I've got a set of prints that match mine and don't, a light that loves circles, a radio that learned my thoughts well enough to hum them back at me, and a zipper on a recording that opened when I didn't touch it. If I had to offer anything, it would be this. Lock your tent, and if you hear a zipper in the night, don't grab the pull like you're doing the world a favor. Whoever taught me that lesson did it the old way, by giving me a thing I can't unhear and asking me to carry it until I get tired and put it down. Today, I carried it far enough to write this down. Tonight, I'm setting it on the table and letting it be what it is. And if I wake at 3 and the room is a little colder than it should be, and I catch the faint sound of teeth, finding teeth from the dark corner near the closet, no, I won't get up to check. I'll lie still and let the morning open first.